Yeah, hello. So I think you hear a debate playing in the background. I just want to share my screen. We just had a nice debate on Twitter. I recorded the space. Twitter spaces are a great place to be. You're missing out if you're not on Twitter. I want the world to be on Twitter and on LinkedIn and everywhere. We should all be accessible and we should be non-anonymous as far as possible. People know my name, Nishan Xavier. Of course, I travel all around the place. I'm in Chennai, I'm in Trichy. Could be in Israel or in America soon. Could be going to Singapore or Malaysia. So I could be anywhere. Usually, I'm in one of my homes, right? In either in Casa Grande Apartments or in Trichy, near Milo Road, but near Bishop People College. But so be it. Okay, so leave it. That is not important. That is not relevant. The important point is we had a debate about the historical Jesus. A very interesting, important debate. Let me just replay for you. Let me firstly share the screen. No, not that. That is share. Share the screen. Refutations of market priority. Where is Saatvata. So bro Saatvata's profile, he has around 14,000 followers. I have around 6,000 followers. So pretty much the same, but I have around 6 million views. I think he may also have around 6 to 10 million views a year. So that's good. We're both, reaching millions for, of course, different ideologies. And so I just want to play, then we can understand. Let me, Satvata, are you there? Or maybe he joined, but let me quote F.F. Bruce, 1910 to 1990. Luke's historical statements are unsurpassed in their trustworthiness. Sir William Ramsay's work did much to establish the basic historical reliability of Luke's account. So Luke is very clearly an eyewitness account. It's not written post 70 AD. It's probably written, we will see, by 48 AD. St. Luke's account is probably being widely disseminated in the churches. 55 AD is 2 Corinthians 8:18, and St. Paul is saying, they're sending with him the brother whose praise is the gospel distributed through all the churches. One brother of St. Paul is obviously St. Luke, who also wrote the gospel. And so by 55 AD, the three synoptic gospels have all been written. We're going to be coming to that in a minute. Okay. But let's just talk a little bit more about the gospel of St. Luke. Let me quote four other authorities um, beside I quoted Sir William Ramsay, I quoted Bruce. My next authority is Ian Sherwin White. Quoting many authorities to show that Luke's credibility was very much attacked in the last University of Manchester. And Ian Sherwin White says for Acts, and we know Luke Acts are basically two volumes of the same book written by companion of Paul, named Luke. 100%. For Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of deep detail, must now appear absurd. Okay, so Ian Sherwin White is again confirming this research, and we're going to see something very interesting. So Saint Luke, when he's writing to Theophilus, when many other people also join, he's writing to Theophilus, was probably the Jewish high priest Theophilus by Ananus. In the first in the first part of his work, the Gospel, calls him most excellent Theophilus, indicating that he's still in office. But in Acts, he doesn't call him most excellent Theophilus any longer. It's about 20 years later. 61 AD. And at this time, he just calls him Theophilus. Okay, so let me read a little more about Sir William Ramsay. I can quote many other scholars who are agreeing with him, but let me just read a little bit more. You can read this from the 1 Peter 5 article, and it's just, Further study showed that the book of Luke Acts could bear the most minute scrutiny as an authority for the facts of the ancient world, and that it was written with such judgment, skill, art, and perception of truth as to be a model of historical statement. So William said about St. Luke in particular, author of the Acts to Theophilus, who almost certainly was the high priest Theophilus Ben Ananus, Jewish high priest from 37 AD to 41 AD. Acts was written around 61 AD, and Theophilus still lives but no longer is high priest, and thus is not addressed as most excellent Theophilus, but rather as just Theophilus. So William has said, you may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historian. They meet the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Other scholars commenting on his work have agreed. Ramsay, after a lifetime of research, ranks Luke as the greatest of all historians, ancient or modern. The Gospel stands the same test that it's undergone. It is not only the most beautiful book in the world, it is written with the utmost care and skill. Gospels are early historical records. They are eyewitnesses by the of Lord Jesus Christ. So I just want to ask if anyone has any objections. You're free to come up and free to say something. But mainly, I want to hear from Saatvata. Throw any difficulties on your side, technical difficulties or this. Yeah,
Can you hear me? I just want to make sure. I'll give you the 5 minutes fully. I don't want to just interrupt if you're still making an argument.
sure, sure. I can hear you, bro. So great. Okay. So if you're ready to give me 5 minutes more, and then I'll give you 10 minutes. At 6:45 here. So up to 6:50 I can speak, and then 6:50 to 7 a.m. you can speak. Does that sound good?
Okay, no problem.
Great. So I think I made a very good case for Saint Luke's credibility so far. Let me move a little ahead to Saint Matthew's, and or have I completed the case for Saint Luke? Yeah, so I would say St. Luke is writing between 37 to 41 AD, but St. Paul delays the publication of the Gospel of St. Luke till around the Council of Jerusalem, 48 AD, which is mentioned in Acts 15. And at that time, St. Paul gives the go ahead to publish it, and by St. Paul writes 2 Corinthians. Even secular Encyclopedia Britannica agrees that 2 Corinthians was written around 55 AD, and this is mentioned in the article. Um, shall I read that part? Yeah. And also Saint Jerome mentions that Saint Peter was Bishop of Rome from 42 AD to 67 AD. He doesn't call it that, of course. He says the second year of Claudius and the 14th year of Nero. But today we know the 14th year of Nero is AD 67. The second year of Claudius is AD 52. And this is why Saint Luke is such a great historian. I've heard that it's said of a certain pagan god. I don't want to mention it. It's uncertain if he lived in the second millennium BC or in the fifth millennium BC. When St. Luke is speaking about Lord Jesus Christ, he says in the 15th year of the Emperor Tiberius. Again, today, anyone who Google or Wikipedia can look that up. That is the year 29 AD or the year 30 AD. He says Jesus Christ was around 30 years of age, and then he had a 3.5 year ministry because of the Gospel of St. John. Three Passovers pass. So 3.5 years are passing, and then Jesus Christ is dying on 33 Nisan 14 or April 3rd, 33 AD, as I can prove in a separate article, but leave that. So today I just want to show we have established, I think, St. Luke's credibility very much. I also want to establish St. Matthew's credibility because St. Matthew has so much been attacked by the modernists. They say no, St. Matthew. See, one of the reasons atheists, Christians, Hindus, Muslims, we believe, in the divine. We believe in God. We believe in the possibility of prophecy. But according to the atheist modernist scholars, they see 70 AD is very clearly prophesied, especially in the three synoptic gospels. And they say that couldn't have been a real prophecy. Therefore, the gospels should have been allegedly written after 70 AD. But that's not how it happens. But that's not actually how you do historical research. But let me, yeah, let me quote now something about Saint Matthew. So I'm talking 4 minutes. It's 6:46. External evidence from the fathers from Matthean priority. Talking about the gospel. Let me read it. 70 AD. The first and most important dispute in gospel studies between conservative and liberal scholars. The patristic tradition, universally accepted for 1800 years, of Matthean priority or the recent theory of Markan priority requiring a lost Q document which had no ancient historical attestation is correct. This latter theory was promoted during the Kulturkampf in Germany by Otto von Bismarck for political reasons as an anti-Catholic endeavor to reduce the authority of the papacy, which is especially evident in the Gospel of St. Matthew. It's a famous passage in Matthew 16:18, where it's considered by Catholics, Jesus Christ is clearly instituted in Pope. Protestants have a slightly different perspective, but here we have an anti-Catholic Protestant modernist who attacks first the Gospels and then he attacks the Church Fathers. That's where the theory really begins. So let's examine where the evidence really points. External evidence, scholars look at two things. One is called the internal evidence of the Gospel itself. Secondly, the external evidence of what the companions or the next generation has said about the earlier thing. Just like if you're looking at Gandhiji's history, for example, what Gandhiji himself has said, or and then what Gandhiji's closest companions have said, whether Nehruji, Dr. Ambedkarji, or any of the Charles Freer Andrews, one of his favorite missionaries, his favorite Christians, was such a gentleman, and he supported India's independence. Earlier, the British abolished sati. Before Darwin, they were doing such great works. Right? They were very compassionate people. After Darwin, they became very selfish. This guy, Charles Freer Andrews, who's a Christian missionary, he's so gentle and he's supporting India's independence. And Gandhiji said, "No man has ever served me who created a
Talking about Charles Trier Andrews, a very
so let me just continue. Let's examine where the evidence was. External evidence is absolutely demonstrated. Saint Matthew the Apostle himself wrote the Gospel of Matthew, wrote first, and wrote well before the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem.
absolutely demonstrates Saint
This is
Matthew
attested to by Bishop Saint Matthias, New Saint John the Apostle, by Father Tertullian in Africa, by Saint Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Lyons in Europe, but well acquainted with the tradition of the East, having spent a significant time in Asia, and several other witnesses. Thus, we have the unanimous witnesses of three whole continents of Africa, of Europe, and of Asia, and virtually the entire early Christian world, that Saint Matthew the Apostle is the first of the evangelists and wrote his gospel well before 70 AD. Saint Jerome had even seen the original Gospel of Saint Matthew, which had been carried by Saint Bartholomew the Apostle to India in the library of Caesarea and the Hebrew dialect. The Hebrew itself has been preserved until the present day in the library at Caesarea, which Pamphilus here is Saint Eusebius Pamphilus, that the father of church history, as he's called. He wrote 10 books about church history from 61 AD, where Luke Acts ends to around 325 AD. Saint Constantine is converted. There have been 250 years of pagan persecution of Christians, and then 1,500 years of Christianity begins. By the way, when St. Patrick finds an island full of pagans, pagans just means polytheists. He doesn't go and he punish them or persecute them or anything. He goes and he evangelizes them. And at his death, at his birth, island may have been 1% pagan, 1% Christian, 99% pagan. But at his death, it was 99% Christian, maybe 1% pagan. Okay, because he worked miracles and so many other things. And my time is almost up. I have about 1 minute more. Saint Jerome had even seen the original Gospel of Saint Matthew, which had been carried by Saint Bartholomew the Apostle to India at the library of Caesarea in the Hebrew dialect. The Hebrew itself has been preserved until the present day. The library at Caesarea, which Pamphilus so diligently gathered. I've also had an opportunity of having the volume described to me by the Nazarenes of Berea, city of Syria, who use it. So you might have heard of these Indian Christians called the Nasranis. They are also very close, like the Nazarenes. The name itself is so similar. They also have Nabavi Peshita, and they have a Syriac name, very much like the original Gospel of Saint Matthew. So there are very many possibilities, and the Western scholars don't understand these things very well. They do not research India so much. But my time is almost up, and I yield my remaining time. I want to hear from the Saatvata. I want to hear the opposing perspectives. Yeah, please go ahead. Are you saying something, Saatvata? Because I can't hear. Can others hear?
So every now and then there were some issues here and there.
Let me just see if this should. We just put it a little forward. So if anyone wants to come up, you can come, and if you're comfortable that I can go ahead, I can talk for 10 minutes more.
So people who want to,
that as well.
read, you
I
can
have
read.
both written material, online material, and some personal material on my computer. I just like to edit my little work. Because new ideas come to me, new suggestions for research. Okay, let me continue. So Saatvata and anyone else, if you can hear me, just send you messages also DMs as well as personally. I put it down. So you're free to ping me to say anything you want. We can reschedule. Yeah, Stephen has said something, but that's not relevant right now. Okay, so Saint Irenaeus is recording the entire history. Saint Irenaeus is again the Bishop of Lyons, who's a witness to both the tradition of Europe as well as Asia. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in the old dialect. See, the tradition is so clear. Again, Africa is testifying to it, Europe is testifying to it, Asia is testifying. And there's nothing contrary anywhere. Again, 2 or 3 witnesses is written in the law. 2 or 3 witnesses are sufficient to put a man to death if he is convicted of being a killer. Even today, it's a principle. 2 or 3 witnesses say, "Yeah, I saw that man kill that. I saw that man kill, I raped this woman." Even today, that would be sufficient even for a capital punishment or at least a life in prison.
Hello.
Yeah, yeah.
Wasn't I supposed to have at least 10 minutes?
Yeah,
Or did you hear me, or was it?
I can hear you now, Saatvata. Please go ahead. Your 10 minutes begin now. It's
Call
6:55.
with no meeting with John after that.
Okay. Could you hear my stuff before? Or was it not? Was it not going through?
It was not. It was not audible to me. I'm just going on mute. You can continue.
Okay. Sorry about that. Regarding Matthean priority, which seems to be an interesting topic, and it seems to be in a concern for you. Um, I have, in my opinion, Mark must predate Matthew because both Matthew 2:5 and Matthew 9:2 have the exact same verbatim phrasing except for one word. Idon o Jesus ten pistin auton legei tu paralytico. Now that implies that either one is copying from the other or both gospel writers are copying from the same source. So they could both have been copying from Q, but we don't really know whether that's true or not. But seeing their faith, Jesus says to the paralytic, Greek is a language where you could like change up the word order. And so the chance that idono Jesus ten pistin auton legeito paralytico would be the exact same is extremely unlikely. And so one is copying from another, or both are copying from the same source. But we can be more certain that Mark predates Matthew insofar that Mark's Christology is more primitive. It would be more similar to
So the other
what a
person is giving
Jew would
evidence to this,
expect,
and here how
because
I
Jews
answer
don't believe that
that Matthew
Christ
and
is
Mark have some
Lord.
similarities.
And so
It's,
it in
it's a
Mark
very different reason
10:18
for this
he
thing.
says time leges agaton udes agatos eme es oteos. Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. Whereas Matthew has time erota spiritu agatu es estin o agatos. Why are you asking me about concerning what is good? There's only one who is good. So he's not even Matthew has changed it so that he's not even distinguishing himself from God. He's just saying he's ambiguous. There's only one that is good. I actually Jerome in the Vulgate translation says unus es bonus deus. But what's more important than that is he's saying why he Matthew changes it to say, why are you asking me concerning what is good? Not why are you asking me, why do you call me good? Whereas Mark says, why do you call me good? Matthew says, why are you asking me about
So
what is good?
basically, Jesus in that
Matthew
passage is asking, do you
uh,
realize I'm God?
actually shows a
Very
more
good, very
developed
good. Do you
Christology.
realize I'm God?
He doesn't want to distinguish
Still think
Christ
he's a
from God.
good master,
That
a
would
good leader.
imply a later date.
That's what
Aside from that, regarding many of these points about Sir William Ramsay, that's a fallacious argument because Ramsay was not an archaeologist. Well, he was an archaeologist. He wasn't a
he was an
New Testament
archaeologist.
textual critic. He wasn't a gospel historian. His focus was mainly on the geographical and like the political accuracy of Acts. It
Well,
wasn't on
that
like
doesn't
the
change the
theological
fact that
claims
he
of the
was
Gospels
excellent.
or the authorship of the Gospels, or and so appealing to his argument
I
is
mean,
not
it
really
is.
doesn't really
It's a lot of
address the
but
evidence-based
it's also
argument.
very
I
interesting.
could
It's
appeal
very
to
important.
various like majority of
But this
textual
is
critics,
something very
majority of
important for
gospel
people to
scholars
know.
nowadays
Jesus Christ history
believe
is as
Mark
certain
predates
as the history
Matthew.
of Gandhi or Abraham
So
Lincoln.
if we go by argument to authority, then I mean the argument to authority would mainly apply to modern day scholarship because many of these views, like views of Ramsey, are outdated. They're views that were held like back in the 1900s or 1800s. Aside from that, regarding the travels of Thomas or Bartholomew to India, or the travels of Matthew to Ethiopia, or first century apostles to any of them, to Ethiopia or Armenia or India. There's no evidence of that. Majority of what we know from current scholars is the majority of Jesus' inner circle of 12. He had an inner circle of 12 and he had an outer circle of 70. 70 later became 72. But his inner circle of 12 was chosen. He chose 12 people to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And he chose 70 people to represent the Zechariah, who are the elders. And so he was a devout Jew in most cases. I mean, obviously, Christians believe he is God, but from a historical perspective, he was a devout Jew. And the his mission, his to his when he addresses his apostles, tells them to go to all communities. That's actually a later addition. Um, Based on the readings of Paul, we can tell that Paul is saying that he is the apostle to the Gentiles, whereas Peter and the others, they're in Jerusalem, they're focused on the Jews, trying to convince the Jews that Christ is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Messiah. Obviously, Christ is the translation of Messiah, but they're trying to convince the Jews. And so his inner circle was involved with in the preaching to the Jews, and most of these traditions regarding first century apostles going to Ethiopia or going to Armenia or going to India. These are later traditions. They're I mean they exist in the church, but this is like they're relying on apocryphal texts, not on the Gospels themselves. And
Showed
very few
that
scholars, if
see,
any,
Luke is probably written 30
agree that there were first
180.
century apostles
He's
outside of the Eastern
celebrated very
Mediterranean.
soon after the
Majority of the
Mediterranean.
early Christian um, evangelism was occurring in the Eastern Mediterranean and then later Western Mediterranean. Paul says
Right,
he's going
right.
to set up
So,
missions
Satvata,
in
about
Spain.
5 minutes of your time is up, and you have about 5 minutes. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah,
Much history.
Paul says he's going to set up missions in Spain,
Wait, one thing.
and
Right.
the texts we have, the texts we have, the oldest ones are all manuscripts are all in Greek, and majority of these, like the Syriac Peshitta and the Vulgate, Latin Vulgate, and Vetus Latina, and the Coptic these are all and Armenian. They all draw upon translations from the Greek. So we see a Hellenistic tradition, a Judeo-Hellenistic tradition at the core of Christianity and Christendom in general, and we see aspects like the healing, the resurrection of Lazarus, and like these healing um, methods. These are drawn upon not necessarily from uh, Jewish tradition, but from Asclepius, who was a deity worshipped by the Greeks, and so we see Eastern Mediterranean milieu, a mix of two cultures, a sort of when they when the Christians partake of the Eucharist, this is like a sort of blood magic ritual. They are through partaking of the Eucharist, they are cleansed of their sins, and through baptism they will get into heaven. And so this is like this baptism is drawing from the Jewish tradition, whereas the Eucharist is drawing upon existing like mystery cults that existed in the Mediterranean milieu. So we can be fairly certain this was like something that was developing around Galilee initially and then spread among Gentile communities along the Eastern Mediterranean. And it wouldn't be until a few centuries later that it started spreading elsewhere. So that sort of the argument from tradition that Christianity comes from has always been the same, and Christianity, the gospel, the apostles were preaching all were making taking missions to preach that in to preach the divinity of Jesus Christ is untenable from like the perspective of modern scholarship, and we can date Paul fairly certain because he mentions a king fleeing from a king when he's in Damascus, and that king was ruler in the 6th century. But the other gospels we don't really know. The earliest manuscripts we have are actually for John, but they date to the early 2nd century, and so we
So,
don't
this
have
problem
any
is my
first century manuscripts, and so
Satvata.
the dating based on that
So,
above
take,
70
you're going to
is
give
due to
like
that
10 minutes break. Yes, the
prophecy.
objection.
No stone will lay upon another stone,
But this time, I think
and
the debate is more or less evenly.
but
It's 50-50.
ultimately Mark is the original.
I think it's 60.
Matthew, Luke
I think
are drawing upon Mark and
it's time.
possibly the Q source, the Quell, which is German for source, obviously. But it's a theoretical source. It
Talked
may
about
exist, it
Q,
may
and
not
I'm
exist,
saying
but
Q violates what we
but Mark is the main spine
are
for both
actually.
Matthew and Luke.
Mark,
And we see that there's lines that are exactly identical, verbatim, that would not be expected if they weren't drawing from the same source. If they were like independently writing
actually, Mark wrote
and
the gospel.
documenting their experiences
Matthew
and
wrote
documenting
first,
what
and
they
then Saint Mark
read.
confirmed
And
the gospel.
Since Mark has a more primitive Christology, more similar to the like
Yeah,
Jewish
I just
views,
had the
where
paper
Jesus is
today,
simply a
and
Messiah, he's
it
not
was one article,
God,
and I got
whereas
well, and
Matthew is trying to
signed up,
um,
and
blur the
it
lines
yeah, it was a
between
pleasant debate,
Messiah,
and I
Son of God, and God.
covered
We see
it,
a more
and
developed Christology in Matthew, so Matthew likely postdates Mark.
yeah.
And but in either
So
case, they're not; these are not independent
yeah,
eyewitnesses
another 2 hours
collections.
or so
In
I
fact,
can start
Luke
work
says
on
that he's
well,
drawing upon other
that's
sources.
fine.
He was not an eyewitness himself. So we can be certain that Luke was not an eyewitness to any of the events that he described. So, and
Hmm.
even if we go by like an early date, we can't really prove any of this.
About
We
one
can't
minute.
prove. So, yeah. Basically, how would you reconcile Mark 2:5 and Matthew 9:2 having nearly the exact same wording? Do you think it's like the probability of that is extremely low, and the probability of Matthew 19:17 borrowing from Mark and not vice versa is also extremely low. Also, Matthew 14:3 to 12, it sort of condenses Mark's, but actually it includes details that no longer make sense because the surrounding content was like cut. The context was cut. So Matthew keeps that phrase, "and the king was sorry," but Matthew never introduced it or redirected it. So it's just there because he was borrowing off the other source and he left that, "and the king was sorry." But you don't have any of the other context. So this is what we call editorial fatigue. So he's going off of that other source. It's possible that Mark is going off another source himself, but Matthew is going off that same source as Mark.
Yeah,
And
your time is about up. If you want, we can do maybe like 5 minutes next time, or we can do another 10 minutes
okay,
each. How would you
but
like?
okay, I'm just saying. But Matthew was trimming it carelessly. He left that, "and the king was sorry." Why would he leave that there if he didn't supply the context? Okay, I'm done now. You can speak.
Right, great. It's around 7:07, so I'll speak to maybe 7:12, and then we'll have 5 minutes, and then we'll ask certain direct questions. I want to answer the question about so why is Saint Matthew and Saint Mark so similar? There's clearly a dependence, and we agree with that. We just think the supposition of 12, which has no ancient historical attestation, this violates Occam's razor. It's unnecessary, but there is a dependence. We'll explain. The church fathers have given a wonderful explanation. They are very much aware of it. They say St. Matthew wrote first. St. Matthew wrote in Aramaic as Hebrew to the Hebrews. And we only between 33 AD to 48 AD, the apostles were somewhat tentative about preaching to the Gentiles. They preached as Jews to Jews. That's another suggestion St. Matthew wrote very early. But now by about 42 AD to 67 AD, St. Jerome tells us, St. Peter was the Bishop of Rome. Here he goes to when he sees the Gospel of St. Matthew, he's so happy about it, and he gives public sermons confirming the Gospel of St. Matthew. Right? And St. Mark, his companion or his secretary, in 1 Peter 5:13, he says, "My son, the church here in Babylon salutes you, as does Mark, my son." So he calls Mark a spiritual son, not a literal son, but in a spiritual sense. And so Mark is his son or his secretary. Mark is just faithfully mentioning that St. Peter preaches first. So you can see St. Peter confirm the Gospel of St. Matthew. St. Mark is just writing. Mark is writing. That's why you see Augustine. St. Mark's Gospel is not really that important. And we don't have to postulate anything like St. Peter's confirming the Gospel of St. Matthew. Matthew and Peter, we know, are two of the closest apostles of Jesus Christ. See, I was telling one of my uncles, in my mom's family, there are 4 people. My mom, a brother, a sister, and her 2 brothers. Just one person is going to be telling me something I doubt, but all 4 are going to be confirming and agreeing. Yes, your mother scored a top rank in a medical college. I'm going to totally mentioning about my mother. Because 4 witnesses who lived at the time period are confirming. Same way, if Nehruji, Ambedkar ji are all confirming something about Gandhiji, we know for sure it's a fact. And so that's why we have basically St. Matthew's testimony and St. Peter's testimony. That's enough. Able to explain the dependence on the relation between Matthew and Mark without any unnecessary appeal to a lost source. Okay, and I want to say one thing. See, in St. Matthew, the first line, do you know what the first line is? The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. But in the Gospel of St. Mark, it says, the beginning of the Gospel of St. John, of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So according to you, it doesn't match according to you. Why does he begin with Son of David and then go to Son of God? For us, he has to establish humanity before going to the. I think I'll take the video. But you will say that 8 minutes divinity came 8 minutes. The video. According to you, if Saint Mark came first, then the Son of God came immediately. I'll take the remaining. So it doesn't fit with the modernist theory. But Saint Chrysostom gives another explanation, beautiful explanation. For Jewish ears, there is nothing more dear